No footprints, no intruder, yet someone was in that garden. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing new faces here. Your comments always bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. On a mild June afternoon, St. Mary Mead appeared as tranquil as a postcard. The roses drooped slightly in the heat. Bees hummed about the lavender borders, and the rhythmic sound of a lawnmower drifted from one of the larger houses beyond the high yew hedge. Nothing in the air suggested drama. Nothing suggested murder. The vicarage garden party had always been a minor event on the village calendar. Never so grand as Lady Weston's autumn fete, but dependable, a chance for tea, sponge cake, and gossip in safe abundance. On that particular Saturday, the vicar's wife had set out her best lace cloths and arrayed her china cups on trestle tables. Local matrons fussed over trifles and cucumber sandwiches, while the younger folk whispered behind fans of seed cake about engagements that might or might not be announced before summer's end. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on the edge of the lawn beneath a large chestnut tree, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had long ago discovered that no one paid much attention to an old lady with a basket of wool, which suited her exceedingly well. A quiet presence, a kindly nod, and ears attuned to every nuance. These were her instruments of detection. It was during the raffle, an ill-considered business involving a rather garish China shepherdess, that the disturbance occurred. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a little gasp and pointed across the lawn. Why, good gracious, what on earth is the matter with Mrs. Larkin? All eyes turned, for there, beside the prize rosebed, stood Mrs. Larkin, pale as the lace on her frock, clutching her sun hat with trembling fingers. She had been chatting only moments before, cheerfully remarking on mildew and greenfly. Now she was fixed, staring down at something in the earth with an expression of horror. The crowd rustled forward like a flock of curious hens. Several voices asked questions at once. Colonel Melchett, who always took command whether or not anyone required it, thrust his way through and bellowed, "Now then, clear a space." Miss Marple remained where she was, eyes narrowed. She had seen Mrs. Larkin lean down first, pluck at something among the roses, and then recoil. She rose now, gently, as though her joints complained, and followed at a more measured pace than the crowd. In the rich dark soil at the edge of the rosebed lay a woman's silk scarf, torn and twisted. It was stained, though the heat and sunlight made it hard to tell at first whether the stain was rust, earth, or something darker. Near it, a garden spade rested awkwardly, as though dropped hastily, but what held the company spellbound was the absence of any mark surrounding it. The soil lay smooth, freshly raked by the gardener that morning. Not so much as a footprint disturbed the neat surface. Mrs. Larkin whispered, I was quite alone here but a moment ago. I swear it wasn't there then." The vicar bent forward, muttering, "Most extraordinary," and dabbed ineffectually at his brow with a handkerchief. Colonel Melchett frowned, his voice booming. "No one touch it. This is police business now." And yet, Miss Marple thought, watching the pale silk stir faintly in the breeze, how curious. A scarf with no owner, a garden with no footprints, and a gathering of villagers whose eyes darted far too quickly from one another. She folded her knitting carefully into her bag. A small detail, perhaps, but such details were where truth often chose to hide. The murmur around the rosebed gathered into purposeful hush, St. Mary Mead reserves for scandal. No one stepped onto the smooth, dark soil. The lack of footprints had already achieved the sanctity of a church rope. Mrs. Price Ridley pronounced that silk was foreign and therefore suspicious. Mr. Hawes suggested burglars. He had always wanted burglars. Mrs. Larkin, pale, said again she had been quite alone and that the scarf had not been there, and then it was. Toller the gardener stood apart, jaw set. He had raked the bed at 11. He had left it perfect. He said this to Colonel Melchett, who accepted it like a signed confession and repeated it loudly. Miss Marple, watching Toller's boots, considered the honest caking at the edges and the clean insteps, a careful man with a careful man's dislike of disturbance. Inspector Slack arrived with the air of a man who distrusts fettes and lace cloths. He cleared space and crouched by the scarf without touching it. "No marks," he said. "No tracks. Whoever dropped it took pains." His eyes went to the spade. Toller admitted, reluctant, that it had not been there earlier. "So somebody fetched a spade, set it down, and walked away without walking," Slack said. "Clever." Colonel Melchett tilted his head toward the chestnut. From the tree, faces turned up. A thrush flicked higher, offended. Slack said people did not usually haunt trees at tea time, though he would not vouch for everyone present. Miss Marple's glance drifted to the vicarage windows. They were open an inch for air. A light object might be dropped from there and land precisely. The scarf was light, but the spade, heavy, yet the bed showed no bruise. That, she thought, was interesting, and let the thought rest as one leaves a cake to settle. Gossip produced its ordinary harvest. Iris, the vicar's niece, believed the scarf belonged to the Thursday Sewing Circle's new widow, the one with neat gloves and untidy stories. Mr. Hawes shifted to a theory about tramps. Mrs. Bantry observed that motives travel faster than their owners. Miss Marple murmured that certain birds do too, and 3 heads turned back to the chestnut. "Right," Inspector Slack said. "We treat this as a signal of something worse. No one leaves. Names." The constable produced his notebook. Slack questioned Toller first. Times, tools, view of the bed. Toller's answers were narrow and exact. He had raked. He had gone. He had returned when Mrs. Larkin cried out. He had seen no one near the roses except Mrs. Larkin and a robin. A tremor went along the lemonade table when Mrs. Pierce announced she had not seen Mrs. Templeton since luncheon. "And if there is seed cake within 20 yards, she said, "Mrs. Templeton is a migratory bird." Mr. Templeton, a thin, obliging chemist, coloured and said his wife had felt unwell and gone home to lie down. The sentence did not sound as though it belonged to him. Miss Marple placed it with other curiosities, the open windows, the unbruised soil, and the small dark stain on silk. Colonel Melchett tried comfort. "Prank," he said. Slack agreed that thoughtless youths existed, but pointed to the brownish patch on the scarf. "Thoughtless doesn't always mean harmless." He signalled. The constable slipped a paper bag over the scarf and lifted the spade out without scraping the surface. The earth did not fall inward. It had not been trodden, merely sifted and left to look innocent. Miss Marple sat beneath the chestnut and drew out her knitting. The clack of needles steadied the scene. People came to her without meaning to. Mrs. Larkin sat because the chair was there. Iris stood because she did not know where to put her hands. Even Mr. Templeton drifted within range, his eyes making small, helpless circuits. Miss Marple spoke about roses and lace cloths, and how curious it was that some shops used tissue paper that tore at a sigh. Iris glanced, then hid her hands behind her back. She noticed a faint smudge on Iris's palm. Not earth, but something reddish-brown, rubbed away in haste. Iris said she had been helping with the trestles, and laughed. The laugh was too bright for the shade. Miss Marple thought of other bright laughs, girls who had broken ornaments, and then tried to be the ornament, and filed it away. Slack worked down the line, separating those who had been near the rosebed from those who had not. The list of who had not shrank quickly. In a village, one is near most things. The vicar fetched another notebook. Colonel Melchett repeated sensible things. The chestnut made its dry music overhead. And the garden, conspicuously innocent of footprints, waited like a page written on without a pen touching it. Miss Marple, without looking up, made a small private resolution. There were 3 places to examine before the sun went down. The upstairs windowsills, the thorn that had borrowed tissue, and the short strip of bricks edging the bed. If one watched people's feet, she had learned long ago, one often learned what their heads were hiding. Inspector Slack had not yet released anyone. and so the garden party dissolved into clusters of uneasy conversation. The lemonade jugs and sponge cakes stood untouched. The scarf's removal into an evidence bag had not quelled the unease, but rather magnified it. It hung in people's thoughts like a storm cloud refusing to break. Everyone present was both relieved and resentful that they were detained. And it was in that charged, watchful atmosphere that gossip grew legs and began to run. Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice, though quite obviously intending it to carry, spoke of Mrs. Templeton's mysterious absence. One can hardly fail to notice she is not here. And now this dreadful business. I should be very much surprised if the two are not connected. Mrs. Bantry, with her usual dry practicality, pointed out that Mrs. Templeton had been seen earlier at the grocer's, quite her usual self, purchasing far more sugar than any household could possibly require. At this remark, several heads nodded knowingly. Excessive purchases were often interpreted as signals of domestic trouble. Mr. Templeton himself, standing uncomfortably with his long fingers twitching at his hat brim, reiterated that his wife had felt faint. The more he spoke, the less convinced the listeners seemed. He grew redder, and his words thinner. Miss Marple, sitting quietly once again beneath her tree, saw the way his eyes darted toward the rose bed and then away, as though he feared being accused by mere proximity. His manner was not the manner of guilt, she judged, but of a man perpetually cowed, who lived under the shadow of stronger tempers. That was a different matter altogether. Colonel Melchett, after consulting in low tones with Slack, made a declaration that the scarf would be tested, though he admitted to those nearest that the procedure was slow and often inconclusive. This gave rise to a chorus of comments about the efficiency of Scotland Yard compared with the local constabulary. Mrs. Larkin, who had discovered the scarf, now trembled so violently that the vicar's wife fetched her to a chair, pressing her to sip barley water. "It is shocking, positively shocking," Mrs. Larkin kept repeating, though her eyes glittered strangely as if she half enjoyed the centre stage. Miss Marple, needles in hand, listened as Iris whispered to her cousin that she had seen Mrs. Templeton in close conversation with a stranger near the post office 2 days before. Iris's tone carried the thrill of having been the possessor of a secret. Her cousin whispered back, "Tall man, dark hair," and Iris nodded with emphasis. Miss Marple let her eyes drop to her knitting, her mind tracing quietly the chain of implications. A stranger in St. Mary Mead, a woman absent from the fete, a scarf with a stain and no footprints. It was a pattern, though still faint. Inspector Slack meanwhile asked the vicarage maid to bring down a list of those who had been formally invited to the garden party. This exercise, half an hour late, produced more disorder, for it revealed the presence of 2 guests who had not been invited at all. One was old Mrs. Foster, who defended herself with indignation by saying she had been coming to garden parties for 40 years and would not be turned away at her age. The other was a young woman unknown to most, claiming to be a distant relation of the Larkins. She had slipped away, however, during the commotion, and could not now be found among the assembled crowd. The constable was dispatched to look for her in the lanes. That revelation spurred a wave of conjecture. Some were sure the mysterious young woman had been responsible. Others argued it was too obvious. Colonel Melchett frowned but said nothing. Slack muttered that people vanished too readily for his liking. Miss Marple observed with mild interest that the scarf had been discovered precisely where the sunlight fell strongest upon the roses, a place designed to draw notice. It was, she thought, a curious instinct for any prankster or criminal to display evidence rather than conceal it. The sun had begun its slow descent, and shadows lengthened on the lawn. The villagers, restless and uneasy, longed to be dismissed. Yet Inspector Slack insisted upon speaking individually with each person, which he did with brusque efficiency. Miss Marple watched, noting how some met his questions with verbosity and others with guarded brevity. Iris, when asked, gave her answers too quickly, with an eagerness to be believed that was almost a performance. Toller, the gardener, repeated his earlier testimony with the unbending stubbornness of a man whose pride lay in his work's perfection. Mr. Templeton stammered, faltered, and grew visibly miserable. It was only when Slack turned his eye toward Miss Marple that she smiled benignly and replied in her gentle way. She had been knitting, she said, and had observed very little. A scarf was a scarf, a spade a spade. Yet as she spoke, she recalled with precision the subtle reactions of each villager, cataloguing them silently. Slack, underestimating her as usual, moved on without further pressing. At last, after much muttering, the inspector announced that people might disperse, though they were to remain in the vicinity until further notice. Relieved, the guests drifted away in twos and threes, resuming whispers as they passed through the vicarage gate. The fete was over, the cakes sat half-eaten, the tea cooling in the pot, and the garden bore the strange aura of a stage where a play had been interrupted before the final act. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, watching as the constable still searched among the shrubbery for the vanished young woman. She bent, as though to pick up a dropped ball of wool, and studied the edge of the rosebed. The soil there told a subtler story than the bed itself. The faintest displacement of grit along the brick, a trace of something having been balanced and then withdrawn. No footprint, no mark, yet still a human presence had been here. She folded her wool, rose with the slight effort of her years, and set off, down the lane toward home, her thoughts knitting as silently as her needles had done. Somewhere, among the ordinary chatter of neighbours and the ordinary anxieties of domestic life, lay the thread that would unravel the mystery of the garden with no footprints. Miss Marple, more than anyone, knew how very extraordinary ordinary people could be. Miss Marple did not go straight home. She took the side path by the vicarage wall, where time sweetened the heat, and met the vicar's wife at the kitchen door. There had been such a fuss, said the vicar's wife. Would Miss Marple take a little tea? She would, and if it were not inconvenient, might she step upstairs a moment and see about the window over the rosebed? A silly draught, she said, could sound like a ghost in a quiet house. The vicar's wife, who trusted her as one trusts a mender of lace, led the way without a second thought. On the landing, the casement stood ajar by 2 finger breadths. Miss Marple did not touch it. She bent close and studied the sill. There, at the outer edge, lay a faint waxy smear with the palest breath of pink. Beside it, a delicate crescent where yellow pollen had been pressed and slid. Dust motes hesitated in a slant of light. Nothing at all, the vicar's wife declared, apologising for the dust. Miss Marple asked whether any of the ladies had been up and down. Iris, it seemed, had flown upstairs for extra raffle tickets and returned pink with importance. A dear girl, said the vicar's wife, only she does everything as if the clock were chasing her. In the small bedroom next the landing, the blind was half drawn. From here one might lean at ease. Miss Marple measured the distances with her eyes, the drop to the border, the breadth of the bed, the bright patch where the scarf had lain. A hand could hold and aim. A light breath would finish the business. But the spade would not take its place in that picture. She tucked the objection away, like a difficult pin saved for later. They went down. In the parlour, she lifted the sewing basket lid with a word of thanks. Beneath reels of cotton lay tissue for dress patterns. The top square wore a small torn crescent, as if it had caught and been tugged. On its edge, her forefinger found the thinnest trace of brownish red, rubbed nearly clean. She closed the lid and praised the vicar's wife's orderliness. Inspector Slack's tread shook the step while the compliment was still in the air. He was out of patience with vanishing girls and with gardens that refused to accept footprints. Told of the open window, he said any number of windows were open in June. Miss Marple agreed mildly and mentioned the smear on the sill and the torn tissue. Slack looked, grudgingly impressed, and wrote it down as though the paper had offended him. Together they crossed the lawn. Evening made the roses falsely innocent. Miss Marple examined the brick edging. The grit had been nudged into a tiny runnel, as if a thin rod had rested there. Near the shed lay a length of bamboo cane for peas. "Trellising," said Toller gloomily, hating disorder. Slack frowned and turned the cane. "You aren't suggesting someone lowered that scarf like bait?" Miss Marple said one could lower many things with a stick, and something finer than string. Washing lines, she observed, had performed more miracles than people credited. Slack sent the constable to hunt cord or fine line. The vicar's wife, eager to be useful, produced a reel of thin grey twine from a drawer by the scullery. There seemed less of it than she remembered. She blamed the housemaid. Miss Marple thought otherwise and kept her thought. Mr. Templeton came along the path, hat twisting in his hands. Might he collect his wife's shawl from a chair? Slack asked where Mrs. Templeton was. "Resting," said Mr. Templeton, with the air of a man who uses the word when the truth would bruise. Miss Marple inquired, almost idly, whether Mrs. Templeton favoured any particular lipstick. Mr. Templeton blinked and supplied a cheerful shade a little young for his wife. "By post," he added, attempting a smile that slid away. Slack had the paper bag brought so he might see the scarf. Mr. Templeton looked and shook his head quickly. His glance at the rosebed was not guilty, only tired. The constable returned with kite string and a boy's fishhook. Kite string might serve. The boy swore he had possessed more of it earlier. Slack said, "Boys forgot." Miss Marple, bending again to the brick, drew up a tiny glint on her fingertip. Slack tipped it into his palm. "Powder?" "Face powder," said Miss Marple, with a most determined scent. She had met it often enough on cheerful lips and anxious hands. "What do you make of that?" Slack asked. "Only that someone leaned where ladies seldom lean, and in a hurry," said Miss Marple. Her gaze drifted to the upstairs windows, then along the path toward the lane where the unknown young woman had vanished. If one wished every eye upon roses, one would provide something else to admire first. Slack scowled at the village as though it were wilfully perverse. "Meaning?" "Meaning," said Miss Marple gently. "That display and concealment are cousins, and they visit together." She asked whether Iris would kindly show her the sewing circle's patterns that evening. She wanted, she said, to copy a sleeve. Iris brightened at once. Arrangements were made for 8 o'clock at the Larkins. As the little group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered beneath the chestnut and looked once more at the bamboo cane, at the tiny runnel in the grit, and at the upstairs casement now properly shut. There were enough threads to begin a pattern, though she suspected the figure would not be the one the village expected. A scarf could fall without feet to drop it, but a spade, she thought, does not carry itself to a bed, nor set itself down delicately on unbroken soil, unless guided by a very steady hand, or drawn to its place by a line that left no mark a boot would make. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive calm. Lamps glowed in cottage windows, and the lanes smelled of honeysuckle. Yet beneath that stillness the whole village buzzed with speculation. In the parlours and kitchens, voices hushed and rose again, every household adding its embroidery to the mystery of the scarf, the spade, and the garden bed without footprints. The fate, ordinarily destined to fade into memory, with nothing more exciting than a rain shower, had become the sort of tale that stitched itself into local history. Miss Marple walked home with the slow, deliberate pace of one whose eyes and ears are never idle. She noticed curtains twitch where none usually did, and 2 boys crouched on a wall whispering as though they had witnessed a ghost. When she reached her little thatched house on the lane, she set aside her shawl and kettle, but did not at once light her lamp. Instead, she stood a moment at the window, gazing into the dimming street. She was thinking of Iris Larkin and her quick, bright laugh, of Mr. Templeton's restless hands, of the missing young woman who had slipped away with no one able to say where. Each piece alone was ordinary. Together, they were troubling. A gentle tap at her door drew her back. It was Dolly Bantry, flustered and rosy from the walk. Dolly, never one to restrain her tongue, burst out that the whole thing was too peculiar by half, and that she was quite sure the stranger girl was in it. Who else would vanish just at the moment of discovery? Mark my words, Jane, she'll prove the key to it. Miss Marple poured tea and let Dolly's words tumble out. She asked no questions, only made small murmurs of agreement. When Dolly at last paused to breathe, Miss Marple inquired whether she recalled if Iris had been upstairs long when fetching the raffle tickets. Dolly frowned, uncertain, but then remembered she had noticed the girl descending with unusual haste, colour high in her cheeks. Later, when Dolly had gone and the house was quiet again, Miss Marple took out her knitting. As she worked the needles, her mind reviewed the facts as methodically as the stitches. There was the scarf, placed where all must see it. There was the spade, heavier, needing more than a fluttering drop to rest where it had been found. There was the strange absence of prints and the faint runnel along the brick. And now, too, there were smudges of powder and lipstick and tissue paper torn. Each sign pointed to feminine hands, or at least to someone eager the village should think so. Morning brought a call from Inspector Slack, still restless from a night of unanswered questions. He had had men scouring the lanes for the mysterious girl, without success. Gone clean out of the place, as if she never existed, he muttered sourly. Miss Marple, offering him tea, asked whether he had examined the Templetons' house. Slack said he had, and Mrs. Templeton had been found abed with a headache, quite indignant at being suspected of anything untoward. But, Slack added, her manner didn't sit well with me. Too sharp, too ready with explanations. After he departed, Miss Marple kept her appointment with Iris at the Larkins' home. The girl had laid out the sewing circle's pattern sheets and was eager to discuss fashions. As Miss Marple bent over the papers, she noted the absence of one sleeve design, the very one Iris had been working on at their last meeting. "I fear I mislaid it," Iris said hastily, and her hands fluttered as she spoke. Miss Marple's gentle gaze rested on the girl's fingers. The nails were scrubbed pinker than usual, as though recently scoured. They chatted amiably for some time, and Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift to strangers in the village. Iris grew animated at once, recounting her sighting of Mrs. Templeton with the dark-haired man. "They were whispering, and when they saw me they parted quick as could be. If you ask me, she's been up to something she oughtn't." Miss Marple nodded, though inwardly she reflected that Iris's eagerness to divert suspicion was rather too marked. When she returned home, the vicar himself awaited her by the gate. He was troubled, he said, because one of the parish alms boxes had been forced in the night. Nothing of great value was gone, yet the timing disturbed him. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A theft, a missing girl, and a garden display designed to draw notice. These were not isolated happenings. They bore the signature of design, of someone orchestrating confusion. She walked with the vicar back toward the church. Along the way she saw, half hidden in the grass verge, a broken length of grey twine knotted at one end. She stooped, picked it up, and slipped it unobtrusively into her pocket. The vicar talked on about the morals of the younger generation. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts far away. She was beginning to see how the puzzle pieces might arrange themselves, though the image was still blurred. As evening fell once more over St. Mary Mead, the villagers gathered again in their cottages, whispering about what might come next. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, her knitting folded, her mind alert. The spade had been lowered, of that she felt sure. The scarf had been bait, a lure to draw every eye, and behind it all was not chance but intention. Someone was playing a game, calculated, precise, and dangerous. Miss Marple, more than any, understood that behind the homely curtains and polished teacups, darkness could linger, and she also knew that in this particular game, patience would be her sharpest weapon. Morning found St. Mary Mead pretending at innocence. The milkman clattered along, the postwoman's bicycle tick-ticked past garden gates, and the church bell gave a decorous single note because the verger liked machines to know their place. Miss Marple, having watered her sweet peas, put on her hat, and walked to the high street with the air of a lady who remembers jam rations and never wastes a step. She called first at the grocer's for tea, and, quite by chance, chose the moment when Mr. Templeton was emerging from his chemist's with a cardboard box under his arm. He looked thinner in daylight, as if the sun had bleached courage as well as colour, and blinked at finding himself observed. "How kind you were yesterday about your wife," Miss Marple said, as though praising a child's drawing that had cost effort. "I always think headaches do better for a short stroll." Mr. Templeton gave a frightened smile and said Mrs. Templeton was resting still. He had, he admitted, been up half the night because the police had made such a to-do about that silly scarf. His voice warmed slightly as he spoke of tinctures and sal volatile. A man will retreat into his craft when life's traffic frightens him. Miss Marple asked, purely to satisfy an old curiosity, whether he had lately stocked a very determined face powder, the sort that arrives before its wearer enters a room. Mr. Templeton coloured. Yes, he said. His wife had adopted such a thing, and a younger lady too had fancied it. A new shade, all sparkle and insistence. Coral mirage, he added, with the embarrassment of a man overheard reciting nonsense. The younger lady had paid in coins, all small, and had laughed when they chinked. "Coins can be so talkative," Miss Marple murmured, and left him with a kind word that calmed him even as it puzzled. She crossed to the green, where two village boys lay along a low wall launching invincible battles with twigs. Boys remembered what adults pronounced unimportant. One had only to ask for the story of a kite or a dog. "Have you had good winds?" she inquired, and at once a tale poured out of a kite lost in the chestnut by the vicarage last Thursday, and a pretty lady who had borrowed their string to fish it down because they were butterfingered. The lady had paid them with a half-crown so new it squeaked and had smelled powdery like Aunt May, only more bossy. The string, they said, had been very thin and very long, and the lady had knotted it clever as a sailor. Miss Marple's eyes turned for a moment toward the church roof flashing through the trees. A half-crown from a lady's purse is a treat indeed. The boys produced it triumphantly, and she, admiring, asked, had they kept all their treasure? Not all, it seemed. A small rain of coppers had come besides, from another lady, with a hat like a cake, who had asked the way to the station and wished them luck with their kite. They had not seen her face well. "A cake?" repeated Miss Marple gently, and they described a confection of felt and ribbon that could have crowned several heads in the village. She thanked them and walked on, her mind counting, not money, but intentions. Practice before performance. Many a decent village sin had followed that order. At the church, she found the vicar hunched over the alms box with a screwdriver and a conscience. He looked up guiltily, then admitted he was merely convincing himself that what was forced last night could not be forced again. "It is not the sum," he said. "It is the spirit of the thing." Miss Marple agreed. Theft of small coins indicated haste or scruple or both. "One pays for journeys with what one has," she observed, "and one hides discomforts by placing brighter objects before them." The vicar asked what she meant. She spoke of fêtes and distractions, and very softly of gardens that held the eye, so the house behind went unstudied. He frowned, then brightened. He had been sermonizing on precisely that the previous month. Miss Marple commended his theology and left him comforted without quite knowing why. From there she went by the Larkins. Iris opened the door with too much speed, as if rehearsed for friendliness. The sitting room smelt faintly of scent. Patterns lay neatly arrayed upon the table, and obligingly, Iris produced thread and a new sleeve to replace the lost, no, mislaid one. As they bent together, Miss Marple remarked upon the excellence of Iris's knots. "I had an aunt," Iris said, "who made me do and undo until my fingers knew the work by themselves." Miss Marple asked whether Iris had ever flown a kite. Iris laughed brightly and too long. "I haven't time for children's games." Then she added, too quickly, that some silly boys had pestered her on Thursday by the vicarage, asking to show her their string tricks. The addition did not mend the first answer. It frayed it. While Iris fetched a thimble, Miss Marple's eyes took a quiet inventory. A scrap of grey twine coiled near the window latch, a smear of that same resolute powder at the edge of the mantel, a tissue flower from a hat, crushed and reborn. She touched nothing, only admired, aloud, youth's capacity for neatness when properly challenged. Iris flushed as girls do when praised for a virtue they did not intend to show, and began to talk in little leaps about Mrs. Templeton and strangers and how some women never know their age. Miss Marple listened until the thread of eagerness tangled itself. "Truth," she said kindly, "is such a shy thing. If one chases, it hides. But if one tends one's sewing, it slips out like a timid cat." On her way home, she paused beneath the chestnut. The bark still bore a faint polish where hands had recently learned it. The brick edging held its tiny runnel as though remembering a cane's paws. From an upper casement drifted the stubborn sweetness of coral mirage, a scent that arrived 2 minutes before its mistress and waited 5 minutes after she left. Miss Marple folded her hands on the handle of her basket and let the village hum around her. Someone had required coins and string and a vantage and had rehearsed, as tidy people do, until tidiness itself seemed innocence. All that remained was to learn whether the pretty lady and the lady with the cake hat were one, or a pair plucking the same tune. She did not doubt the tune's destination. It would end, as such tunes do, at a door someone dared not open. And before it opened, a little more brightness would be scattered on the path to dazzle the eye that tried to see. Inspector Slack had not given up the case, though he pretended otherwise. He prowled about the lanes of St. Mary Mead with the look of a man who suspects everyone of idleness, crime included. The villagers, for their part, feigned normality but thrived on conjecture. The scarf had become a kind of ghost, draped invisibly across conversations in kitchens, shops, and hedgerows. People whispered whether blood had stained it, whether Mrs. Templeton's faintness was illness or calculation, whether Iris's laugh hid more than it showed. In so small a place, absence of certainty was as disturbing as a bell tolling the wrong hour. Miss Marple, in her parlour, sat with her knitting and listened to what reached her ears through 6 friendly callers. Dolly Bantry came again, bristling with theories. Mrs. Price Ridley dropped in with self-importance disguised as concern. Even the vicar's wife, ordinarily charitable, hinted at something peculiar in Iris's behaviour. Miss Marple asked few questions, but her mind arranged their gossip as one arranges scraps in a patchwork, separate pieces forming a pattern none of them recognised. The pattern grew sharper when Colonel Melchett called in person, accompanied by Slack, and asked whether she had noticed anything odd. She described, with an air of innocence, the faint smudge of powder at the window, the scrap of twine near the church verge, the boy's kite-string tail. Slack shifted uneasily, muttering that she saw things no one else did. Colonel Melchett, though respectful, pressed her. Did she believe the scarf incident and the arms box theft were linked? Miss Marple hesitated delicately, then answered that she found it difficult to suppose coincidence in a village so small. If one distraction drew eyes to the roses, perhaps another ensured the sound of a lock breaking went unheard. Slack looked grim, for the arms box theft had been a detail he had not broadcast. By late afternoon, the inspector had Mrs. Templeton fetched to the vicarage for further questioning. She arrived, with her hat set square and her manner sharper than any thorn on the rose bushes. She dismissed headaches as an excuse, said she would not tolerate being made into village theatre, and blamed her husband's nerves for every whisper against her. Yet when Slack produced the coral mirage powder box found in her room, her composure wavered. She explained quickly that every woman in England had the same shade these days. Colonel Melchett glanced at Miss Marple, whose expression remained one of gentle sympathy, though she was turning over in her mind how the powder lingered in places no woman ordinarily touched. The interview was interrupted by news that the unknown young woman had been found after all. She had been walking toward the next village, travel bag in hand, and was brought back protesting. Her name, she said, was Phyllis Green, A distant cousin of the Larkins indeed, though no one had ever heard of her before. She insisted she had left the fete because she disliked scenes, and she denied knowing anything about scarves or spades. Slack eyed her skeptically, for her shoes were dusty in a way that suggested a longer journey had been intended. Miss Marple, watching her, thought not of lies but of fear, the kind of fear that imitates bravado. That evening, alone again, Miss Marple considered the twin possibilities. Either Iris, eager and careless, had devised the spectacle to cover some mischief, or Mrs. Templeton, bitter and restless, had contrived to throw suspicion upon a younger woman. Phyllis Green complicated matters, for she might be pawn rather than player, lured here to serve as scapegoat. The broken twine and the smudges, the kites and the coins, all suggested rehearsal. But rehearsal for what? To frighten, to conceal, or to accuse? She folded her knitting, sat back, and remembered other gardens. An orchard where a child once broke a window to suggest a burglar, a herbaceous border where a jealous neighbour left a glove to implicate another. People, Miss Marple reflected, often betrayed themselves not in the bold strokes, but in the tiny flourishes they thought would go unnoticed. And so, tomorrow, she would look more closely at Iris's sleeve pattern, at Mrs. Templeton's coins, and at Phyllis Green's shoes. Somewhere between them lay the true hand behind the scarf in the garden, with no footprints. As the clock chimed 9, the village settled into uneasy quiet. But Miss Marple sat a while longer, her eyes half closed, her mind knitting faster than her needles ever had. Something, some small detail already glimpsed, was waiting for her to pick it up and turn it over. When it came, she knew, the entire design would reveal itself, neat and inevitable as a finished sampler. The next morning Miss Marple went out early, basket on her arm, as though bound for the grocer, though her steps did not take her directly to the high street. Instead, she turned down the lane by the Larkins' cottage, where the hedge grew tall and ragged. From within came the sound of Iris humming to herself. The tune faltered when Miss Marple knocked, but Iris opened with a smile that seemed fixed in place. She had been stitching, she explained, and showed Miss Marple the half-finished sleeve. The stitches were neat, too neat, like a performance designed to impress. Miss Marple complimented her, but asked whether she had heard that Phyllis Green had been brought back to the village. Iris flushed and said she scarcely knew the girl, though she must be some relation. Her tone was dismissive, but her fingers twisted the thread as she spoke. Miss Marple remarked gently that Phyllis seemed a nervous sort, perhaps frightened more than guilty. Iris laughed quickly, too loudly, and insisted guilt often dressed itself as nerves. Miss Marple did not argue. She let the laugh linger and then turned the talk to Mrs. Templeton's absence from the fete. Iris grew more animated, suggesting Mrs. Templeton had secrets enough to fill a cupboard. She dropped her needle twice in the telling. Miss Marple left her with a kind pat, but in her mind the impression deepened that Iris was trying too hard to push the suspicion elsewhere. At the high street she met Colonel Melchett, who confided that Inspector Slack was unconvinced by Phyllis's account. She had been found with money enough for a train journey and had resisted giving any clear explanation of her purpose in coming to St. Mary Mead. Melchett wondered whether Miss Marple believed her tale of cousinship. Miss Marple said mildly that she was not sure the girl's story was wholly her own. Melchett frowned at that, but she would not explain further. By midday, the vicar's wife came bustling in with news that Mrs. Templeton had quarrelled violently with her husband, loud enough for half the street to hear. Some swore she had accused him of weakness, others that she had mentioned a stranger's name. Mr. Templeton had retreated to his shop, with a face pale as parchment. Miss Marple considered this tidbit with her usual calm. Rows in themselves were not extraordinary. What mattered was what people shouted when they forgot to guard their tongues. She stored the fragment beside the memory of Mrs. Templeton's powder lingering at the window sill. In the afternoon, Dolly Bantry called and repeated the gossip that Iris had been seen near the church the previous night, though Iris had declared she was home sewing. Dolly, gleeful with discovery, insisted this proved Iris guilty of something. Miss Marple knitted on, her eyes down, and remarked that young girls often walk when they are troubled. Dolly scoffed at such leniency, but Miss Marple had noted her neighbour's relish in accusing. It was one thing to repeat what one heard, quite another to point with eagerness. She did not share Dolly's confidence, but she did not dismiss it either. Later, Miss Marple took a quiet path to the church herself. There she examined the verge where she had found the scrap of twine. With patient eyes she looked again, and this time saw a faint mark in the grass, as though a bag or box had rested there briefly. Kneeling with difficulty, she pressed her fingers to the soil and felt a slight indentation, light but definite. A traveller had paused there, perhaps uncertain whether to go on. Rising slowly, she brushed her skirt and turned her gaze toward the lane leading away from the village. If Phyllis Green had been set upon leaving, she might have lingered here, waiting for courage, or for someone else. When evening came, Colonel Melchett summoned a small gathering at the vicarage to speak with the principal figures again. Mrs. Templeton arrived in high dudgeon, claiming persecution. Iris came too, nervous but eager to appear cooperative. Phyllis was brought reluctantly, pale and silent. Slack questioned each in turn, but their answers tangled rather than clarified. Mrs. Templeton contradicted herself twice, Iris spoke too readily, and Phyllis kept to short denials. The inspector grew irritable. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the tea tray, said little. Yet she observed. She observed Iris flinch when the scarf was mentioned, though she tried to cover it with a cough. She noticed Mrs. Templeton's disdain sharpen most when Phyllis was accused, as if eager to see blame fixed there. And she saw Phyllis's eyes dart toward the window whenever raised voices threatened, like a bird trapped indoors. At last the meeting broke up without resolution. Slack muttered of fools and liars, Melchett rubbed his brow, and the vicar fretted over the impropriety of such scenes in his house. Miss Marple rose, offered mild thanks for the tea, and stepped into the cool night. She paused beneath the chestnut once more, looking up into the branches that whispered in the breeze. There was a design in all this, she was sure. A scarf placed as lure, a spade lowered without prints, coins scattered to distract, a theft in the church to cover a need, and a girl entangled who seemed more victim than culprit. Iris, Mrs. Templeton, Phyllis, each had played a part, but only one had arranged the stage. Walking slowly home, Miss Marple's mind drew the threads tighter. Someone had rehearsed, prepared, and chosen the garden with purpose. The absence of footprints was not a mystery of chance, but of careful artifice, and artifice always left its seam. She believed she was close now, very close. But she would need to test the truth with her own quiet method. Tomorrow, she would devise a way to let the guilty hand betray itself, not with evidence, but with the unguarded flicker of human nature that no rehearsal could disguise. Miss Marple rose early and walked to the vicarage with the mild decisiveness that always meant trouble for disorderly plans. She paid 2 brief calls, first to Mr. Templeton for a tiny bottle of glycerin for rose cuttings, then to the vicarage, where she borrowed, with apologies, a length of very slender twine for parish packages. She tied the twine in her bag beside a folded scrap of tissue and walked out into a morning bright as polished crockery, every hedge rinsed by dew. Her feet took her not to the high street, but back to the vicarage lawn. The rose bed had resumed its prim virtue. The brick edging kept its hush of grit. The chestnut stirred, as if remembering a whisper. Inspector Slack found her there and expressed in one snort his view of amateurs. Miss Marple agreed cheerfully that amateurs were troublesome and asked whether he would indulge her with a little demonstration, only to satisfy an elderly curiosity. Slack, who liked proofs even when he disliked the provers, grudged permission. Colonel Melchett arrived in time to see Miss Marple take from her bag the twine and a square of light tissue. She looped the twine over a bamboo cane, stood at the brick edge, and lowered a teaspoon, borrowed from the vicarage tray, until it rested on the soil without bruise. A gentle tug lifted it back. The twine slid easily, leaving the bed as untouched as a Sunday conscience. Next, she let the tissue flutter and guided it by the same pulley until it settled precisely on the bright patch where the scarf had lain. Nothing disturbed the raked surface. "There," she said. "One may place and remove from a distance." Slack conceded the point with a grunt. "But a spade isn't a moth." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet even clumsy objects obey patience. Lean from the border, inch by inch, with the cane as fulcrum. No weight, only balance. And one may lay the blade as neatly as a book on a shelf. It requires rehearsal." Toller, against his will, nodded. The description matched too well the angle he had first seen. "Who rehearses such nonsense?" he demanded. "Someone who means people to look at roses instead of windows," Miss Marple said. She returned the teaspoon and twine to their owners and asked Slack for a quiet word with Phyllis Green. Phyllis waited in the vicar's little library like a small animal in a hedge. Miss Marple sat beside her and talked about journeys begun with more hope than money. Bit by bit, the girl admitted she had come because of an unsigned letter promising help and cousinly protection if she arrived quietly and left quickly when told. She had been given a little money in coins. "Who told you?" Phyllis shook her head. There had been no name, only an instruction that a cousin would vouch for her and that she must not ask questions. "And do you know Iris Larkin?" "Only since I came. She is kind when people are watching." Miss Marple asked about the new powder Iris wore. Phyllis wrinkled her nose. "It gets everywhere. Twine. A ball in her work-basket." Miss Marple thanked her and asked for one further courage. To come to tea that evening and sit quietly until called. Phyllis promised. All afternoon Miss Marple tidied her doubts. She coaxed from the village boys a cheerful memory of Iris practicing clever string tricks by the vicarage on 2 afternoons, paid with new coins and praise. She listened to Toller's exact account of the spade, like a gentleman about to sit, and to Mrs. Templeton, who received her with hard politeness and a hat that announced battle. Miss Marple admired it, mentioned that some powders lasted longer on windowsills than on faces, and watched the mouth grow thin. "Young women," Mrs. Templeton said, "prefer charades to character." "Often because someone has set a stage," Miss Marple answered, and took her leave. At 7, the vicar's wife, with Colonel Melchett for presents and Slack for discipline, assembled a small restorative tea. Mr. and Mrs. Templeton, Iris Larkin, Phyllis Green, Toller, and Miss Marple. Conversation tried to behave. Cups trembled only slightly in saucers. When talk had smoothed itself into false comfort, Miss Marple spoke as if pursuing a purely domestic curiosity. "Has anyone ever lowered something onto soft earth without leaving the least mark?" Iris laughed, bright, quick, and a shade too loud. "That is play," she said. "String games." "Then show me a loop," Miss Marple replied kindly. "My fingers are hopeless." She opened a modest paper parcel and took out a pale square of silk. No one pretended it was the original. And a length of twine neatly pre-knotted. "Iris, my dear, would you set this correctly?" Iris coloured. "I don't know such things." "Oh, my eyes are old," Miss Marple murmured, turning the slip so its invitation lay plain. "One passes here, draws there, and the knot falls into itself if one has practiced." Her fingers, clumsy by intention, stumbled. "You do it!" Silence breathed. Iris looked round the table, at Mrs. Templeton's sharpened smile, at Mr. Templeton's misery, at Slack's alertness, and then down at the twine where escape seemed to lie. Her right hand moved faster than her caution. The loop slid and tightened with the neat, inevitable ease of work learned alone. It made a small, satisfied sound. Slack leaned forward. Melchett's eyebrows climbed. Miss Marple folded the silk and said, very gently, "Thank you." She did not triumph. She looked almost sorry. "You have practiced, Iris. Once for a scarf, twice for a spade, and often enough to forget your own care when a knot sits crooked." It was a pretty scene you set. Powder on the sill, tissue torn, coins to make boys useful, and a frightened girl to carry away the village's pity. But people, she added softly, are not props. Quite gently. Iris's fingers froze above the loop she had made, then she laughed too brightly and pushed the twine away. Parlour tricks, she said. Anyone could do that. Not quite anyone, Miss Marple answered, her tone so kindly it left no bruise. One must practice. One must also obtain coins in small change to hire assistants, and a very distinct powder to sign one's performance. You bought Coral Mirage last week, Iris, paid in coppers. Iris's colour wavered. Mrs. Templeton gave a short laugh. There, you see, I told you that girl. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Mrs. Templeton, you also played a part. You met a gentleman by the post office 2 days before the fete. You quarrelled with your husband so loudly that the village could hear. You chose a powder that travels. But this scene, the scarf lowered, the spade balanced, the tissue torn, the smear upon a sill, belongs to Iris. Inspector Slack rapped the table. Motive, he said. Pretty tricks are not crimes by themselves. Iris spoke low. You wouldn't understand. Her eyes went to Mr. Templeton. I only meant to frighten her. Her? Slack prompted. Mrs. Templeton. The name came with a shiver older than Iris's years. She found letters, mine, foolish letters to a man passing through. She said she would show them if I didn't pay. I hadn't the money. I thought, if people talked of gardens and scarves, she might be too busy denying to ruin me. Mrs. Templeton's chin lifted. I advised you for your good. You asked for £5, Iris said, colour rising. And you sent for Phyllis to help yourself to pity. You told her to come as if she were kin, so she could be about when things turned ugly, and you could look generous. I saw your letter. A small exhalation went round the table. Phyllis clutched her teacup. There was no name, she whispered. No, said Miss Marple. Our Mrs. Templeton prefers everyone else to hold the blame. She did not stage the garden. She salted the scene afterward. Powder where powder had no business, voices where quarrels would be heard. It was Iris who learned the string, who paid the boys and borrowed their line, who chose the bright roses for the fall, and who slipped to the church to break a poor box for coins. Iris flinched. I meant to return it, only to give her half, so she would keep quiet and I could find the rest. Slack's voice roughened. You admit the theft? Yes, Iris whispered. I was desperate. Mr. Templeton made a wretched sound. My wife, he began and faltered. His glance at Iris was unguarded, pity and something like apology. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. Mr. Templeton, she said, you have been bullied so long that strength has forgotten your address. You did not know of the letters. But your counter sold the powder and the lipstick for this drama, and you saw who bought them. Mrs. Templeton drew herself up. I will not sit here and be slandered by amateurs. No one slanders you, Miss Marple said. We simply put things where they belong. You did not extort money? Then explain the unsigned note that lured Phyllis, written on the pale blue paper you keep for orders, and the sudden plenty of small coins in your handbag this morning. For a heartbeat, Mrs. Templeton's eyes flashed. Then the disdain returned. My affairs are my own. Just so, Miss Marple murmured. And Iris's are hers. Only you made them yours as well. Young girls write foolish letters. Older women sometimes do foolish things, such as brandishing reputations to feel taller. Slack cleared his throat. Enough. The theft is chargeable. The rest, blackmail, will depend on evidence. It will not be necessary, Miss Marple said. Iris, you will tell us where you hid the alms coins and the boy's string, and Mrs. Templeton will recall whom she met by the post office. Dark hair, commercial traveller perhaps. Silence again. Then Iris's shoulders folded. Behind the church organ, she said, in a biscuit tin. The string too. She looked at Phyllis. I am sorry. I thought if you were here, People would look at you and not at me. It was cruel. Phyllis nodded. I should have gone away. Miss Marple touched her hand. You should have been kindly used. That is all. She turned to Slack. You have your facts, but see that they do not make you blind. No one died. A reputation is a tender thing. Deal with it as carefully as with raked soil. Colonel Melchett exhaled. And the scarf? He asked. The stain? Animal blood from the chemist's waste, Miss Marple said. Convenient when one wishes colour without consequence. The rest was theatre. Slack rose, brisk now that events had chosen their lanes. Miss Larkin, you'll come with me. Iris stood, then stopped. I only wanted her to stop, she said. Not to the room, but to where her childhood still waited. I thought a fright would make her stop. Frights seldom reform, Miss Marple said. They only shuffle wickedness to a different drawer. The little parlour at the vicarage had grown very still after Iris's hands betrayed her. Inspector Slack had carried out his duty with brusque efficiency, taking Iris away into official custody, though not without a glance toward Miss Marple that admitted her quiet triumph. Mrs. Templeton, still indignant, gathered her gloves and her hat like armour and swept out, her husband trailing meekly behind. Phyllis Green lingered uncertainly by the door until Miss Marple touched her arm and suggested she come to the Bantries for a few days where she would be safe from unkind tongues. The girl's eyes filled with tears of relief. When the others had gone, Colonel Melchett turned to Miss Marple with a shake of his head. You make it sound so simple, he said. And yet we blundered about for days, tripping over distractions. It was simple, Miss Marple replied gently, folding her hands. Human nature always is, though it rarely looks so at first. A girl frightened of exposure, a woman too eager to hold power over another, and a scheme designed to draw every eye to roses instead of to hearts. People often forget that the things they try hardest to hide are already written on their faces. The Colonel sighed. And the footprints, or lack of them. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Only a trick of string and patience. Any village child with a kite could have taught us that. But what mattered was not the trick, you see. It was why it was attempted. Iris wanted to protect her secret by creating a greater mystery. Poor foolish child, she did not understand that secrets shrivel when spoken, but grow monstrous when smothered. Slack had gone. The Colonel soon followed, and the vicar busied himself with collecting the abandoned teacups. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, looking out at the garden beyond the window. The roses glowed in the dusk as if nothing at all had ever disturbed their peace. Yet she knew the village would not forget so quickly. Whispers would travel, reputations would falter or mend, and kindness would be weighed against cruelty in parlours for months to come. That was the way of St. Mary Mead, as of any place where lives overlap too closely to allow real privacy. At last she took up her basket and walked home under the chestnut trees. The night was mild, the air still scented faintly with coral mirage from some lingering trace. She thought of Iris, so young, undone by her own eagerness and vanity, and of Mrs. Templeton, older, but driven by a bitterness no less destructive. Phyllis would recover. Mr. Templeton perhaps would find his voice after all. The village, outwardly, would settle back into calm. But for those who had watched events unfold, there would always be a faint unease when they passed the rose bed at the vicarage, the place where a scarf had once lain, without footprints. Miss Marple reached her cottage and set down her basket. She did not light her lamp at once. Instead, she stood at her window, listening to the quiet of the lane. She was thinking, as she often did after such affairs, that human beings were infinitely inventive in their follies, yet curiously predictable in their fears. The disguises might alter, the props change, but the heart beneath was always the same. With a small sigh, she drew the curtains, lit her lamp, and reached for her knitting. The needles clicked softly in the silence, steady and sure, while the village of St. Mary Mead returned almost to its tranquil sleep.